They said bullets curved around him in the air. They whispered that he could melt into the mountain fog like a ghost, that he'd made a deal with the devil himself in some dark and lonely hollow. For years, the name Jacko Fraser was enough to make a child stop crying and a grown man bolt his door at night. The law called him a murderer. But the people who lived and died in these hills had another name for him: the White Devil. But how does a man become a monster? How does flesh and blood turn into a legend that haunts a landscape for 100 years? Today, we hunt for the truth behind the ghost story. To understand a man like Jacko Fraser, you first have to understand the world that made him. Imagine the Cumberland Mountains in the late 1800s on the jagged border of Virginia and Kentucky. This was a land forgotten by God and the government, a place of stunning beauty and breathtaking cruelty. The mists that clung to the hollows hid deep secrets, and the ancient hills had seen more than their share of blood and tears. The Civil War had ripped through these communities, leaving behind not just poverty, but a generation of men who had been taught that the fastest way to solve a problem was with a rifle. They came home to find their farms in ruins and their futures uncertain. The law, in this part of the world, was a distant rumor. A county sheriff might hold authority in the dusty courthouse square, but out in the winding creeks and isolated cabins, his power faded to nothing. Here, a different law held sway: the law of the clan. Family was everything. Your name was your flag. Your cousins were your army. An insult to one was an insult to all, and debts of honor were paid in blood. This was the era of the great feuds, like the Hatfields and McCoys, where violence was not just an outburst of anger, but a structured part of life, a grim inheritance passed down from father to son. This fierce loyalty was born of isolation. The dense forests and impassable ridges didn't just separate families from the outside world, they separated them from each other. Every farmstead was its own small kingdom, every cabin a fortress. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, and a man representing the government was seen as the biggest stranger of all. People here learned to rely on themselves, their kin, and their own judgment. But self-reliance couldn't always put food on the table. This was a world of grinding poverty. Families survived on what they could scratch from the rocky soil, what they could hunt in the deep woods, and what they could distill in a hidden still under the light of the moon. For a man with a quick trigger finger and no conscience, the desperation hanging in the air smelled like opportunity. It was into this boiling cauldron of pride, poverty, and clan justice that Jacko Fraser was born. The world he saw was not a place of laws and morals, but a battlefield for survival. The mountains were poised on a knife's edge, holding a fragile, violent peace. But that peace was about to be shattered, not by an invading army, but by a monster it had created in its own image. Long before the massacre that made him a legend, Jacko Fraser's name was already a poison whispered on the mountain wind. He didn't exist in a vacuum. His terror was fed by a network of lesser evils and silent supporters. Men like Henley Cox, his most notorious accomplice, were drawn to him like moths to a flame, lesser predators orbiting a greater one. And there were others, the small-time crooks who bought his stolen goods, the informants who'd trade a neighbor's whereabouts for a silver dollar or just to settle an old score. The Mullins clan, on the other hand, were the opposite of everything Jacko stood for. They were a large, well-respected family, a cornerstone of the community, which made them the perfect target for a man who wanted to prove that no one and nothing was safe. The deepest wounds in these mountains were often the oldest. Jacko himself was said to be a veteran of the Confederacy, a man who had seen the world burn and decided he liked the heat. He didn't come back from the war looking for peace. He came back carrying the war inside him, a personal battle against a world he felt had failed him. His grudge wasn't over a single plot of land or a stolen horse. His grudge was with humanity itself. He saw society as a sham, and he aimed to tear its mask off with violence. Of course, smaller, more personal grudges festered in every hollow. A card game that ended in a bitter accusation, a dispute over a property line that had been argued for generations, a family that got a little too prosperous for a neighbor's liking. These were the hidden fault lines running beneath the community. Jacko was a master at exploiting them. He understood the dark currents of envy and resentment that flowed beneath the surface of daily life, and he knew how to use them to his advantage, turning the quiet suspicions between neighbors into open fear. And so, the rumors began to spread, moving from cabin to cabin like a sickness in the air. At first, they were just unsettling stories. A peddler who was supposed to be heading through Pound Gap simply vanished. A farmer found his best mule gone, his tack shed emptied. A lone traveler would arrive at the next settlement pale and shaken, telling a story of being robbed on the trail by a man with eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky. None of these were big enough to bring the law down from the state capital, but they were carefully stacked, one on top of the other, building a foundation of dread. Every story, filtered through a dozen mouths around a dozen hearths, grew darker and more menacing. The whispers turned into a constant, low hum of anxiety that settled over the mountains. People began to look at the shadows a little longer. The sound of a horse at night was no longer a comfort, but a cause for alarm. The community was being slowly poisoned, not just by Jacko's deeds, but by the fear of what he might do next. The stage was being set for an act of violence so brutal it would turn whispered rumors into terrified screams. The year was 1892. For the Mullins clan, it was a day of prosperity. Several members of the family, including Ira Mullins, his wife, and other kinsmen, had made the long journey by wagon to the nearest town. They were returning home, their carts laden with goods, and more importantly, their pockets heavy with cash from a successful day of trading. We're talking several $100s, a staggering fortune in those mountains, enough money to set a family up for a year, or to make a desperate man do the unthinkable. Imagine the scene. A narrow mountain path, barely wide enough for their wagons, snaking its way through the dense, dark woods of Pound Gap. The late afternoon sun was beginning to fail, casting long, distorted shadows that clawed at the edges of the trail. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The steady creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the horses were the only sounds in a world that was growing unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The woods were holding their breath. It was a feeling every mountain person knows in their bones. The difference between a peaceful silence and a waiting one. Perhaps one of the men glanced nervously into the darkening trees. Perhaps a child in the wagon pulled a blanket a little tighter around their shoulders, sensing a shift in the air. They were on their own land, just miles from the safety of their homes. But that feeling of safety was beginning to fray like an old rope. They were being watched. Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the forest, a command rang out, a harsh voice slicing through the quiet, telling them to halt. But this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. Before the echo had even died, the trees erupted in a blaze of rifle fire. The led horse screamed and reared, falling in its traces. The quiet evening was shattered by the roar of guns, the splintering of wood, and the first cries of shock and pain. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. The point of no return had arrived, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap of violence that would stain these mountains forever. The ambush was brutally efficient. The narrow pass became a slaughter pen, a claustrophobic trap from which there was no escape. The first volley of shots sent a wave of chaos through the wagon train. It was a cacophony of terror, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the rock walls, the splintering of wagon boards, the high-pitched screaming of wounded horses, and the raw human cries of disbelief and agony. Men who had been solid, living figures just a second before now crumpled to the ground, becoming nothing more than dark shapes in the failing light. But the attackers were not wild animals in a frenzy. They moved with a chilling purpose, emerging from the tree line like specters. Among them, One figure moved with a terrifying calm, his pale eyes scanning the wreckage with an unnerving detachment. This was not a fight. It was a harvest. As the survivors scrambled for cover that didn't exist, Jacko Fraser and his men moved in, their rifles barking with methodical precision, each shot finding its mark. Ira Mullins lay wounded in the dirt, the life seeping out of him onto the very land his family had worked for generations. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Jacko Fraser standing there, his face as impassive as carved stone. There was no rage in his eyes, no flicker of emotion at all. It was the cold, empty gaze of a man looking at an object, not a human being. A revolver appeared in Jacko's hand. The metallic click of its hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the world. Then came a single sharp report that slammed the door shut on Ira Mullins's life. With the killing done, a new and even more grotesque phase began. Jacko knelt beside the body of the man he had just executed, and with the calm demeanor of a clerk counting change, reached into his pockets and retrieved the thick roll of money. This cold ritual was repeated as the gang moved from one still form to another, their hands searching pockets and pouches. They were not just murderers, they were grave robbers, desecrating their victims before the bodies had even grown cold. When the last echo of gunfire had faded and the last coin had been pocketed, what remained was a tableau from hell. A wagon lay on its side, its contents, flour, cloth, tools, spilled across the dirt road like the entrails of a dying beast. The horses lay tangled in their harnesses, their great bodies still and silent. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, hung heavy and motionless. It was the silence that was the worst part, a profound, deafening silence where just moments before there had been life, laughter, and hope. And as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Jacko and his men didn't flee in a panic. They simply stepped back into the deep woods, swallowed by the same shadows that had birthed them. It was as if the mountain itself had opened up, unleashed its demons, and then closed again, leaving behind no evidence of their passage, only the wreckage of a family and a silence that screamed. This was more than a robbery. It was more than murder. It was a statement written in blood on a lonely mountain trail. It was a declaration that there were no safe places, that the bonds of family and community were no shield against a man with a frozen heart. On that day, in the twilight of Pound Gap, John Fraser the outlaw died, and Jacko, the White Devil, was well and truly born. The silence that followed the massacre was deeper than any grave. For a time, the only witnesses were the ancient trees and the cold, unblinking stars. It was a kinsman sent out from the Mullins homestead when the wagons failed to return, who stumbled into the nightmare. He found the scene not by sound, but by its terrible stillness. The dark, hulking shape of the overturned wagon, the pale glimmer of spilled flour on the ground looking like a dusting of snow, and then the bodies, scattered among the wreckage like fallen leaves, their stillness an affront to nature itself. The cry that broke from that man's throat was a sound of pure horror, an animal howl of grief that finally shattered the unholy calm. When the news reached the Mullins family, it was like a physical blow, a shock that left them gasping for air. But in the Appalachian heart, grief is a fast-burning fire that quickly turns to iron resolve. The women's wails of sorrow echoed through the hollows, a heartbreaking chorus for the dead. But the men's faces were a different kind of terrible. Their grief was silent, their eyes hard and cold, their hands resting on the stocks of the rifles that were never far from reach. They tenderly carried their dead home, but in their hearts, they were already carrying a vow of vengeance. News in the mountains travels not on wires, but on the wind, passed from cabin to cabin in hushed, urgent whispers. The story of the Pound Gap massacre spread like a plague of fear. It confirmed every dark suspicion, every campfire ghost story. The name Jacko Fraser was no longer just a name. It was a curse, the living embodiment of every settler's deepest fear, the fear of what lurked in the untamed wilderness just beyond the light of their lanterns. Doors were bolted earlier. Men took their rifles with them to plow the fields. The comfortable darkness of the mountains, once a familiar blanket, now felt like a shroud, filled with unseen, malevolent eyes. The sheer brutality of the attack was too much to be ignored, even by the distant and often indifferent hand of the law. The murders weren't just a crime, they were an insurrection against the very idea of society. The authorities in both Virginia and Kentucky, pressured by the influential families and a terrified populace, were finally prodded awake. A substantial reward was offered for the capture of Jacko Fraser and his gang, a fortune that could make a poor man rich for life. The notice was nailed to the courthouse doors and the sides of general stores, turning the ghost into a wanted man with a price on his head. The bodies of the Mullins family were laid to rest in the cold mountain earth, but their story refused to be buried. The massacre became a line drawn in the dirt. On one side was the world of families, faith, and hard work. On the other was Jacko Fraser. He was no longer just an outlaw. He was the White Devil, a figure of folklore born from a real-world atrocity. The hunt was now not just a matter of law, but a crusade. The question was, how do you hunt a man who is already a ghost? The bounty posters were barely dry before the hunt began. This was not going to be a simple posse of local farmers. The states of Virginia and Kentucky marshaled their forces, calling in the best they had. They hired professional detectives from the famed Baldwin Felts agency, outsiders with city methods and a reputation for ruthlessness. But the man chosen to lead the hunt was a legend in his own right, Marshal Big Ed Hall. He was a man cast from the same mountain rock as Jacko, who knew every secret trail and hidden hollow. He was Jacko's opposite, a man of the mountains who had chosen the badge over the outlaw's gun. And alongside the lawmen and hired guns rode men with faces like stone. They were the kin of the murdered Mullins family. They weren't there for the reward money. They were there to settle a family score, and their justice wasn't written in any law book. Hunting Jacko Fraser in the Cumberland Mountains was like trying to catch a whisper in the wind. He was in his element, a predator on his home ground. The very landscape that the posse found so punishing was his greatest ally. The mountains that had cradled him now conspired to hide him. For weeks, they combed the ridges and ravines, a grueling ordeal of cold nights and false trails. The posse would find the embers of a campfire still warm, or a footprint in the mud of a creek bed, only to have the trail vanish into thin air. It was as if Jacko could simply dissolve into the mist. The mountains that had once been a home to the posse members had now become a deadly labyrinth, and in its center lurked a monster who knew every turn. The posse grew weary, their resolve frayed by frustration and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. They knew Jacko was out there, seeing them long before they saw him. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be an ambush, every shadowy rock formation a sniper's nest. But in the end, it wasn't a tracker's skill or a detective's logic that cornered the White Devil. It was human weakness. A name was whispered to the lawmen, an informant, tempted by the life-changing reward or simply terrified into submission, gave up Jacko's hiding place. The mountain's code of silence had finally been broken by the one thing stronger than loyalty: fear. The tip-off led them to a lonely, isolated cabin near the Kentucky border. They surrounded it in the dead of night, a ring of steel closing in under a moonless sky. As the first grey light of dawn touched the peaks, Big Ed Hall gave the signal. The quiet morning was torn apart by a final desperate volley of gunfire as Jacko tried to fight his way out. But it was hopeless. He was one man against a small army. When they dragged him out into the light, blinking and bloodied, the posse members steeled themselves, expecting to see a demon. Instead, they saw a man. His clothes were ragged, his body weary from weeks on the run, but his eyes His eyes were the same. In their icy depths, there was no fear, no regret, not even anger. There was only a profound, chilling emptiness, and the bottomless exhaustion of a man who knows his road has come to an end. For the lawmen, it was the end of a manhunt. But for the Mullins kin who stood there, watching the man who had destroyed their world, the look in their eyes said that true justice had not yet begun. The arrest of the White Devil was a sensation. His trial in Wise, Virginia, was a pilgrimage. People came from 3 states, on foot, on horseback, and in wagons, clogging the dusty streets of the small county seat. They weren't there to see justice done. They were there to see the monster in a cage. The courthouse stood under the watchful eye of armed guards, its lawn transformed into a sprawling camp of onlookers. The air buzzed with a carnival-like energy, a strange mix of grim satisfaction and morbid curiosity. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a public exorcism. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick enough to choke on. Every bench was crammed, with men standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The judge, the lawyers with their starched collars, the 12 men in the jury box, they were all part of a system trying to impose its formal logic on a story of primal savagery. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Their voices trembled with a mixture of grief and lingering fear as they recounted the horrors of that evening in Pound Gap. They pointed trembling fingers at the man sitting at the defendant's table, and Jacko Fraser just sat there. He showed no remorse, no fear, not even a flicker of interest. As survivors wept on the stand, he watched them with the same detached curiosity a man might watch a bug crawling across a windowsill. His silence was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. He was a void, a black hole of human feeling in the center of the room, and his cold, defiant calm was his final weapon. He refused to play their game, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He was a monster, and he seemed content to let them know it. The trial was, as everyone knew it would be, a formality. The evidence was absolute, the testimony unshakable. When the jury filed back in, their faces were grim and set. The foreman didn't need to clear his throat. His voice was steady and clear as he pronounced the single word that everyone had come to hear: guilty. A collective sigh, a wave of relief and whispered approval washed over the courtroom. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of his duty, sentenced John Jacko Fraser to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. The law of men had spoken. But as the crowd spilled back out into the sunlight, a question hung in the air, unspoken but felt by every person who called these mountains home. Was this justice? A clean, quick, state-sanctioned death on a gallows? Did that truly pay the debt for the ambush in Pound Gap, for the cold-blooded murder of men in front of their families? The law had delivered a verdict, a neat and tidy conclusion. But the justice of the mountains, the old law of blood for blood, demanded something more. It demanded an ending as brutal as the beginning. The court had provided a legal answer, but the people were still waiting for a final moral one. On September 15th, 1893, a trapdoor opened in Wise, Virginia, and the physical life of Jacko Fraser came to an end. They say a great sigh of relief swept through the crowd, as if a poison had finally been purged from the air. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a common fate for notorious outlaws, to prevent his final resting place from becoming either a shrine or a site of desecration. The earth simply swallowed its monster, leaving no stone to mark his passage. The man was gone, but his ghost was just beginning to walk. The story of the Mullins family did not end in that dusty pass. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and did what mountain people have always done: they endured. Their family line continued, a testament to a resilience far stronger than Jacko's nihilistic rage. Today, their descendants still live in those hills, carrying the memory of the massacre not as a chilling legend, but as a deep and painful part of their family history. Their names are carved in stone in old family cemeteries. The date of their death, a permanent, silent, and defiant answer to the violence that tried to erase them. The world has changed dramatically since that bloody evening. A modern highway, US Route 23, now carves a smooth paved path through Pound Gap. You can drive through the very spot where the ambush happened at 70 miles an hour, listening to the radio, your mind a million miles away. But if you pull over to the side of the road, cut the engine and listen, the modern world falls away. The woods are just as deep, the shadows just as long. In the quiet, you can almost feel the weight of that terrible silence from so long ago. The old courthouse in Wise still stands, a brick-and-mortar witness that has held the story within its walls for over a century. And of course, there is the legend of the treasure. Like all famous outlaws, Jacko was rumored to have stashed his ill-gotten fortune, thousands of dollars in gold and silver coin, somewhere in the labyrinthine caves and crevices of the Cumberland Mountains. For decades after his death, treasure hunters, armed with old maps and older rumors, dug into the hillsides, chasing the ghost's promise of cursed gold. The treasure was never found, of course, but the hunt itself became a part of the story, keeping the White Devil's name alive, a whisper of greed and danger that echoed through the generations. Most people have forgotten the facts of the case. The official records are yellowed and brittle, gathering dust in courthouse archives. But the mountains have a long memory. The name Jacko Fraser still surfaces from time too in these parts, a dark ballad told around a late-night fire. He is no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a piece of the landscape itself, a warning, a folktale, a permanent shadow that time has not been able to erase. So we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. How does a man become a monster? The story of Jacko Fraser gives us a chilling answer. He wasn't born a demon. He was forged in the fires of a brutal war and hammered into shape on the anvil of a lawless, desperate land. He was the ultimate consequence of a world where civilization was a distant rumor and survival was a daily battle. The White Devil wasn't a supernatural force. He was something far more terrifying, a man who had shed every last piece of his humanity and embraced the darkness that waits inside us all. And how does a monster become a legend? His cruelty was so absolute, so far beyond the normal feuds and fights of the mountains, that people had to make him more than a man to understand him. It was easier to believe he was a ghost who could melt into the fog, a demon who had made a pact with Satan, than to accept the horrifying truth, that a human being, a man of flesh and blood, could be capable of such cold, empty evil. The legend of Jacko Fraser wasn't just a story told to frighten children. It was a story adults told themselves to make sense of the senseless. This isn't just a tale of true crime. It's a parable etched into the very rock of these mountains. It is a story of the terrible beauty and brutal reality of the Appalachian frontier. It reminds us that for every hero there is a shadow, and that the history of this place is written in both courage and in blood. Jacko Fraser was more than a murderer. He was the living embodiment of the mountain people's deepest, darkest fear, the fear of what lurks in the shadows just beyond your own doorstep. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.